Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk a little bit more about 6 Days in Fallujah. As I'm sure many of you are already well aware, this game has received a fair amount of backlash from the journalist community, with one of the main arguments being that video games as a medium and art form are fundamentally unsuitable to be used for educational purposes, regardless of the contents within the game, and that those who wish to increase their knowledge on any given subject matter should, quote, read a book. So today let's answer the question as to whether or not video games can be educational. And the short answer is that while most are of little to no educational value, it is also at the same time very true that there are certainly games out there detailed and realistic enough that they can absolutely be used in an educational capacity. And you may be asking, how do we know this? And the answer is very simple, because there are games out there that have been specifically designed from the ground up to be utilized for training purposes. In fact, looking at the development history of Peter Tamte, the man that is doing his best to make 6 Days in Fallujah a reality, one should note the fact that his previous studio, Atomic Games, even developed such a game for the Marine Corps, specifically Close Combat Marines, which has received praise from the Corps itself for being a useful tool to help officers practice with. However, one may be interested to hear that this is far from the first time that a military has utilized games to help train its military personnel. In fact, this particular practice long predates the invention of video games themselves, going all the way back to the mid-19th century, back when what is now considered to be the first modern war game, Kriegsspiel, came to be for the specific purpose of training Prussian officers. In other words, to suggest that it is impossible for video games or even board games to be used in an educational capacity is itself to openly disregard hundreds of years of history when it comes to military training, and to also directly suggest that the various militaries that have utilized various types of games in this capacity have essentially been wasting everyone's tax money in a vain attempt to improve the skill of their officers. In other words, to bold-facedly suggest that video games cannot in any way be used for educational purposes is objectively and definitively incorrect. And it is also objectively and definitively incorrect to suggest that Peter Tamte is incapable of making such a game. After all, his previous studio of Atomic Games has quite literally done exactly that. Having said all this, though, allow me to address one of the most common concerns that comes up when discussing the topic of whether or not video games can be used for educational purposes. And that being that, at the very most, video games are only capable of providing part of the education, and thus cannot be relied upon alone. Now, this is of course a correct statement, but it is also an equally correct statement of books, films, or indeed any other form of media. This is why even in the field of public education, students are given multiple resources in the form of not just books, but also lectures from the teachers as well, which complement the books and also add additional bits of information that may not be found in those textbooks, and vice versa when it comes to the use of the textbooks themselves. In other words, effective education requires a combined arms approach, utilizing multiple forms of media. In other words, going back to the question of whether or not video games can be educational, it is perhaps far more appropriate to instead ask, how could video games as a media, as an art form, not have the capacity to be educational? Especially when there are already examples of them being used in that specific capacity. And when provided with this knowledge, it really does show the foolishness of activists who would demand that games such as 6 Days in Fallujah never be made. Of course, to clear up any confusion that I may have caused here, I will say once again that the vast majority of games have little to no educational value. This is of course because for the vast majority of games, entertainment is the top priority, and it is a good thing that most games are this way. However, developers should absolutely have the right to design games the way they want, including Peter Tamte and his team. And with that said, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.